Welcome everyone to part 9 of module 7. We're going to continue looking at motivation, emotion, and personality, and today we're going to take our first look at the personality portion. So first, just kind of looking at what personality is in general, then we'll start breaking it down into the 4 different perspectives we're going to talk about. So personality, what is that? What does that mean? So we're talking about, there's kind of 2 pieces, right? One is defining what personality is, but we also have to talk about personality psychology, because it's actually its own kind of field of study, which is the scientific study of the whole person. So trying to look at a person beyond maybe one specific thing, where like if I was a clinical psychologist, I would maybe look specifically at some sort of psychological disorder, or if I was a neuroscientist, I would look specifically at, the brain chemistry or something that was going on there. A personality psychologist is going to try and look at an entire person, everything about them. So when we're talking about personality, psychology would define that as an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. Okay, so there's kind of 3 main pieces that are going on. There's thinking, so how do you cognitively think about things, right? If you think about cognitive psychology, that's something we've already talked about a lot. So how do you think? How do you process information? Your feeling is obviously emotion. So how is your emotion presented? How do you understand it? How do you read it in other people? All of that would be considered there. And then obviously acting is behaviors. What kind of behaviors do we carry out? And each of those 3 pieces is obviously going to come together and create the personality of an individual. The other piece to keep in mind is that it is a characteristic pattern. So why this is really important is obviously all of us have moments in time where we feel all varieties of emotions, have all sorts of trains of thought, have all sorts of different behaviors. So it's not really useful to say that sometimes somebody gets mad. Well, that doesn't really tell us something, because everyone gets mad sometimes. When we're talking about personality, it's things that would be considered characteristic of a person, something that we expect to happen. So are there certain behaviors we expect them to do or think are very likely for them to carry out? Are there certain feelings, or are there certain ways of patterns of thinking that we expect this person to kind of follow over and over and over again, or in the same type of situations? Those would be things that we would be considering as personality traits that we would look at. Now, in psychology, there are 4 at least perspectives that we're going to look at personality. Now, obviously, there can be more than this, but these are the 4 main ones. So the first one that we are going to be talking about today is the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theories. And this is kind of technically 2 slightly different groups, but realistically, we're all going to mush it together. You won't see the other 3 in this first video. We're just going to look at that in this first video. In later videos, we'll talk about the humanistic theories, trait theories, and social cognitive theories. Now, again, these are multiple theories in each one, so there's going to be differences for each piece, but we're going to focus on them kind of as general perspectives of looking at, explaining, and understanding personality. So like I mentioned, we are going to start by looking at our psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theories. Now, we're going to start with psychoanalytic, and we're going to talk about what the difference would be between psychoanalytic and psychodynamic. Generally speaking, and we'll get to this a little bit later, generally speaking, in most contexts, you can basically just mush these 2 together as the same group with basically the same ideas. But we'll talk about kind of where they separate a little bit and what the difference is between psychoanalytic versus psychodynamic. So the first thing we're going to talk about is our psychoanalysis, which is, again, all of this is going to be looking at the psychoanalytic theories. So it's really important, all of this stuff that we're talking about, a lot of it applies to psychodynamic as well, but specifically we're going to be looking at psychoanalytic to start. Now, in this, it's really, really important that we always attribute this to Sigmund Freud. Freud is probably the most, if not the most, famous and well-known and possibly even influential psychologist in history. So he is someone that you need to know. His name you should probably have already heard before. And he is really the founder, I guess you could say, of psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is Freud's theory on personality. And what it does is it's going to attribute our thoughts and our actions, so these thoughts and behaviors, to unconscious motives and conflicts. And we'll talk about what these actual unconscious motives and conflicts are. But the general idea is that there's these unconscious kind of forces that are causing the different feelings, different emotions, different thoughts, different actions that we have. Now, psychoanalysis also encompasses the techniques used in treating psychological disorders by seeking to expose and interpret unconscious tensions. So Freud is really, really famous because he was one of the first psychologists, at least one of the first ones that's like really well known for going to and treating people with psychological disorders. Now, this is important because a lot of Freud's understanding about human beings is also going to come from his work with people with psychological disorders, right? And he's going to use psychoanalysis to basically treat these people with these disorders. Again, he's really, really incredibly famous. He's really, really important. As we get through, you'll start to notice that a lot of the things we're going to talk about in this section don't really make a lot of sense, and a lot of them you're going to be like, yeah, that probably doesn't seem true anymore, and we'll kind of bring that around at the very end. But one of the reasons Freud is really important is that he's kind of one of the first people to really take this approach of treating psychological disorders as opposed to thinking there's just some like a demon inside of somebody, and actually think that you can treat these people. But he also represents a huge portion of how we imagine psychologists. So like actually you can look at the comic on the page here. If you ever see a image of a bearded guy with glasses sitting in a chair as another person's laying down on a couch and talking about them, that comes directly from Freud. This is exactly how he would carry out his treatment. And that picture has kind of become the picture of psychology. Okay? So again, just kind of showing that influence that he's had. So let's start talking. Oops, hit the wrong button there. Let's start talking about some of Freud's ideas here. Now, the first thing we have to understand to kind of get into all these other pieces is what is called free association. Now, like I said, a lot of this stuff we're going to kind of come back to again towards the end of this when we start talking about psychodynamics. But free association is the method that Freud kind of creates, or at least popularizes, to treat and understand these different disorders. So free association is used in psychoanalysis. It is a method of exploring the unconscious in which a person relaxes and says whatever comes to mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing. Now, treating things can be very tricky if you believe that they are being caused by unconscious forces, right? Because by just the nature of them being unconscious, that means you can't talk about them, right? You can only talk about what is conscious. So free association is a way that people who, like Freud believed, would basically allow us to expose things that were going on in our subconscious, in our unconscious mind. And again, the idea is if you think about like that guy laying on the couch, they're just going to ask you questions and just tell me about things. Tell me about your life. Tell me about how you feel about this thing. Tell me about dreams you had. Tell me about whatever. Right? We're going to talk and we're going to see some ways that this would be done later. But we're just going to talk about all these things. And what Freud and other researchers who had this perspective believed is that if we look at these different things that are being said, these different things you're talking about, the different symbolism, maybe different emotions that you're feeling, that is going to give us a peek into your unconscious. And if I can understand that, we can understand what's actually happening underneath. One of the big examples of this is what is called a Freudian slip. Obviously, it's named after Freud. So a Freudian slip is when we say the wrong thing out loud. So a simple example of this would be like if you're with your significant other, your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you accidentally call them by the wrong name, right? That would be considered like a Freudian slip. Now, to most of us, right, we would just say that's, it's just a mistake or whatever. What Freud believed is that that was the truth, that there was some sort of grain of truth basically bubbling up in your consciousness and coming out through that slip. Right? So again, we're trying to look at these unconscious processes. Now, we've talked a little bit about unconscious versus conscious. I'm just going to kind of be in the way, I guess, here. I don't know. I'll just stay in the corner. So we've talked a little bit about conscious versus unconscious, or at least we usually refer to it as subconscious. But just to kind of understand a little bit about Freud's perspective, right? Again, this is early psychology, so his perspective is very much going to be influenced by these kind of beliefs that he asserts. So according to Freud, the unconscious was a reservoir of mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. Now we're going to look at this again, but one of the really important things is that these are unacceptable. These are things that are not socially or maybe even personally acceptable, that are just kind of down there. It is full of what we would kind of consider like our more animalistic drives. Our instincts, our urges are all going to be in this unconscious, okay? Now, again, what's important is that these are, generally speaking, things that we would consider negative, at least societally, right? So these kind of urges that we have that we repress would be in this unconscious, in our unconscious mind. In addition, Freud also believed that it contained memories of trauma, uncomfortable feelings, and the thoughts that we repress or block from conscious awareness. Okay, so again, a lot of kind of, you can kind of get a picture already of a lot of negative kind of things that are in this unconscious mind, according to Freud. So that's going to get us to kind of this next step. And obviously you guys understand the conscious mind is pretty easy to think about because it's what we experience every day. So Freud believed that our personality was broken up into three basic pieces, right? There's three parts of who we are. And then this image on the bottom right here is going to be useful as well to think about the conscious versus unconscious. So there's three basic parts. We have the id, we have the ego, and we have the superego. Okay? Id, ego, superego. We're going to talk about each one specifically. One thing that's kind of important to notice is that the ego and some of the superego are conscious. All of the id is unconscious, and then you can kind of see most of the superego is unconscious as well. So you can kind of see how this is divided up a little bit. So what is the id? According to Freud, the id is a reservoir of unconscious psychic energy that strives to satisfy basic sexual and aggressive drives. Now, one thing you're going to notice is you're going to notice kind of conversations here about energies, which sounds very different than the way we would talk about psychology today. We'll talk about some of these kind of departures later on in history, right? How we've kind of gone away from this. But it's this idea that this id energy that we have in our unconscious, and again, it's striving to satisfy these very much aggressive and sexual drives. Now, Freud is really going to focus in on those things, and you're going to notice that as we continue on. He's going to really focus in on sexual drives and aggressive drives. You're not really going to see some of the other kind of pieces, at least as far as the id goes. He believed that the id exists at birth, and it contained all of the instincts and energy necessary for survival, right? That these aggressions, these aggressive drives, and these sexual drives were necessary at survival. The id would operate on what is called the pleasure principle, which is basically demanding of immediate gratification. Okay, you can think of that as pretty straightforward, is that we have this need to have that immediate gratification. We're going to see other pieces come. One thing that's important, the id is there at birth. So one thing that we'll see as we have these other parts that aren't necessarily there at birth, that develop over time, is you can kind of think about how a little kid has this need to have their needs met immediately, right? A little kid wants that the pleasure, whatever it is, if it's a candy bar, right? They don't want to sit and wait. If you think about like the marshmallow test, they don't want to sit and wait for it as a young kid, right? They have to develop that later on. They want that immediate gratification. So the id is what is driving that, according to Freud. So from the id, we get to the superego. Man, I really didn't give myself a lot of space here for these. I'll just block some of this cartoon. From the id, we get to the superego. So these are kind of like the opposite sides. So if the id is like the little devil on your shoulder, the superego is the little angel, right? I kind of like to think of it that way as well. So you've got the little devil and the little angel on your shoulders. So the superego is the part of your personality that represents internalized ideals and provides standards of judgment. You can think of it as your conscience. And as well as kind of future aspirations, right? So again, it's your conscience. You have this little conscience that is telling you not to do bad things, right? This is wrong, or you shouldn't do that. They would say that is the superego. The superego is more focused on how we ought to behave, all right? So the id is focusing on satisfying these drives, the pleasure principle. The superego is focused on the morality principle, which is the need to comply with parental or other authority figures. Now, as we get older, society can be considered an authority figure, right? That we have this need to comply with society, that we have this need to comply with authority. So you can very much see how these two are juxtaposed, right? Where we've got our id, which is has this sexual and aggressive drives and this need to satisfy itself like immediately. And then we have our superego on the other side, which is trying to comply with authority, trying to comply with society, trying to be moral, have a good conscience, right? All those things. These got these two separate pieces. With that, we then get to our ego. So the ego is kind of, you can think about, and that's why this image is on there, you can kind of think about it as the referee in between, okay? We've got our id on one side, we've got our ego on the other. If you want to think about like that cartoon of an angel and a demon, right? The middle is you, right? That's the ego. So the ego is mostly conscious, where like our id is entirely unconscious, and only some of our ego is conscious. The ego is going to be almost all conscious thought. So this is the part of the brain that is trying to basically mediate between these two. It's trying to referee between the id and the ego. Now, ideally, what it's going to try to do is satisfy both as best it can, right? So this is what is called the reality principle. So we want to satisfy the id's desires in a way that will also that will bring pleasure, right, as opposed to pain, but also protect, right, that superego. We don't want to do bad things. So if we wanted to think about this in an example, and I actually want to click really quick just to double check, if we want to think about this in an example, right, this might be, we'll just use this kind of example, I think, as a little bit of a thought experiment. So just to kind of understand what these parts are, right? So let's pretend in this hypothetical situation, right, that you have a friend, a close friend, and you are very attracted to their significant other, their boyfriend or their girlfriend, right, and you're attracted to them. The id, right, would be telling you just to go for it, right? That if for whatever reason there was a situation where there was an opportunity that you could be with that person, you should just do it, and it doesn't care. It's not thinking about consequences, just says do it. That would be the id, right? It's trying to have immediate gratification, okay? Even if people you knew were right there, even if that other person, your friend, was right there in the room, the id is telling you to do it. The superego, on the other hand, would be saying the exact opposite, right? It would be telling you, no, it's wrong. You shouldn't be doing this, right? You shouldn't do this at all. You shouldn't even be thinking about doing this, right? It would be thinking about authority, right? So maybe your friend group is the authority in this context, that your friends would see this as bad, as hurting this other person, right? So your id would be on this side, right? Our ego's on the other side. Our ego then is basically in the middle, right? And our ego would basically be there trying to, one, satisfy our drives and our desires, but while also protecting ourselves from pain, right? Obviously, if you like made a move on your friend's significant other in front of them, that probably would result in some negative consequences in some way, right, later on, and we want to avoid that as well. So it would be kind of juggling and trying to find, well, how do I satisfy these drives while also, protecting myself and trying to do what I think is right or what society thinks is right. And this is basically how Freud saw human psychology working, right? How he saw personality working. And in every person, we have these different kind of pieces that are, some people have stronger ids, some people have stronger superegos, and they're all basically kind of jockeying for control of us, right? And then we've got our ego in the middle that's trying to make decisions. That's going to get us to the next piece, which is the development of personality. So those three, id, ego, superego, are all focused on, what he believed personality was. But we also talk about a little bit of development because he also had theories about development. So Freud believed in what are called the psychosexual stages, or psychosexual stages of personality development. You could add that in as well. What these were childhood stages of development. You can kind of think about them as some of the other stages we've talked about. And during each of these different stages, basically he believed that the id would have these pleasure-seeking energies that would be focused on specific things and specific, what he calls erogenous zones, specific zones. Now, Freud really focused on childhood. He believed that pretty much all of our personality is formed as a child, as a young child, right? So pretty much by adulthood, we're done, right? Or at least I could say maybe adolescence, we were done developing. Now, again, Freud has this he focuses very heavily on sexual and aggressive desires, and you're going to again see those in these different pieces. So sexuality was equal to desire for sensuous pleasure of any kind. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily mean literal, when he'll refer to kind of things as sexual or sensual pleasure. That doesn't necessarily mean it's literal sexual pleasure, right? He's kind of extending these pieces on a little bit, especially obviously because some of these stages are going to be very, very young. It's not that they're getting sexual pleasure, but it's makes them feel good. It's pleasurable. That even has kind of a sexual connotation. So I'm trying to separate that out a little bit, but there is a connection that he makes there. So this is the little table. I'm going to try and get out of the way. Oh, I can fit right here. Perfect. So I'm actually going to give you guys this in the form of a document so you can see these different stages as well. Or you can just kind of pull it right from here because this is pretty much all the information. So I tried to break this up into the parts that are kind of most important for what's going on. And when you guys will see this on, the AP Psych test, for example, I tried to kind of pull out the parts that they kind of tend to focus on. So one thing I want to talk about a little bit is kind of some of these pieces. So we have these different sexual stages, right? Each of them has age that's tied with it. Each of it has an erogenous zone, which is a specific part of the body, obviously. We have a specific event or crisis that will take place, and then we have an outcome due to this event or crisis, right? Basically, you can kind of think of it similar, it's not the same, but in a similar way to, now I'm kind of forgetting what his name was, to the psychosocial stages of development, Erickson's psychosocial stages of development, where we have this kind of conflict that we have to resolve, and then how we resolve that causes problems or, doesn't in our later life. Freud believed the same thing, that basically you would have these stages, and if you didn't resolve this conflict or this crisis that we have, you would basically have what he calls a fixation. Now we'll talk about specifically what fixations are on the next slide, but that's what's in that final column there. So our first stage is the oral stage. It goes from age 0 to 1.5 years old. The erogenous zone is the mouth. The event or the crisis is the transitioning from breastfeeding to solid food. Notice, right, all of this is focused on the use of the mouth, right, oral. You can think about young children are obviously putting everything in their mouth, right, as their way of exploring the world. Freud saw that as this is why it's focused in that zone. Now, again, our crisis, transitioning from breastfeeding to solid foods. Basically, if we were not able to transition out successfully of this stage, we would have a fixation, and that fixation could represent itself in adulthood in different ways. So one way would be overeating, one way would be smoking, one way would be overdependence on sarcasm, right? Now, again, some of these connections, like sarcasm, maybe isn't quite as explicit, it doesn't quite make as clear sense to us just from the outside looking in as something like maybe smoking, which we all consider an oral fixation as well. But this is kind of the connections he would be drawing. Our next stage is the anal stage, which is from age 2 to age 3. The erogenous zone is the anus. The event or the crisis here is the toilet training, which is also reality-based expectations for behavior, right? So our ability to become toilet trained. Our fixation here in adulthood, if we were not successful, would be an obsession over neatness and orderliness. If you have, I don't know if this is a term that's very used very much anymore, but a term for being like very overly obsessive and really neat and orderly would be being anal, right? And that's kind of maybe where this connection is, that term is coming from, or that use of the term is coming from. It could also be messiness, rebelliousness, and a hostile personality. Our next stage is the phallic stage, which is from ages 3 to 6. The erogenous zone is the genitals. Our event or our crisis is the attachment to the opposite sex parent. We'll kind of talk about this a little more specifically later as well as identification with the same sex parent. So attachment to the opposite sex parent and identification with the same sex parent. From here, if we did not successfully get through here and transition out of here, we could create a what's called an Oedipus complex, or a Electra complex, which is basically the male versus female side, castration anxiety, or penis envy. And we'll kind of talk about those later as well. Our next stage is actually it's called the latency stage, which is basically nothing. There's actually kind of just nothing that's going on. So from age 6 to puberty, we basically are in kind of this in-between stage. From here, there are no erogenous zones. He says that sexual desires during this time are repressed into the unconscious, so they're basically held in. The event or the crisis is, there isn't one, right? We are focusing on intellectual and social development, so these other things are not developing. Once we get to puberty, we are going to get to the genital stage. The genital stage starts at puberty, goes on into adulthood. Our erogenous zone is, again, the genitalia. The event or crisis is the development of intimate relationships outside of the family, and the outcome or of fixation in this stage is the normal sexual desire reemerging. Okay, that's what's going to be the outcome here. So again, each of these, right, it is pretty important. They do ask you that you kind of understand and know these different stages. Generally, they're probably not going to ask specific years, but they do expect you to know kind of what event is going on and what the name, which pretty much gives you the erogenous zone, is for each one. So let's give a little more context to fixations. Okay, so a fixation is, at least according to Freud, right? Again, all of this is according to Freud, is a lingering focus on pleasure-seeking energies at an earlier psychosocial stage in which conflicts were unresolved. So again, Freud really thought that childhood development was super important. So he would look at things that you were doing at adulthood and basically connect that to things that happened to you as a child. So for example, like smoking is a good example. Smoking is in some ways considered an oral fix, or can be connected with an oral fixation, right? That's what he would refer to it as. And he would say that this oral fixation is the manifestation of you not basically getting past that first stage, right? That oral stage of development. So basically you didn't transition well, and that created this fixation. And that fixation then manifests itself as an adult in your need to smoke, right? Because of basically the oral pleasure you're getting out of that, right? Now again, when we say like pleasure, it's not necessarily referring to like literal sexual pleasure, but it is driven, according to Freud, by these kind of like sexual id energies that you have. And again, those conflicts aren't resolved. So because of that, you're basically lingering on those energies as an adult. Being stuck in any stage carries the sexual energy from that stage into adulthood, right? So that's basically what I'm talking about. So the sexual energy from the oral stage would be carried on into adulthood and then manifests itself in thoughts, behaviors, feelings, emotions, different things like that. He also said that the fixation can also result if a trauma occurred during that stage. So for example, if you're a infant, right? You're a half a year old or something like that, a few months old, and something happens to you, some sort of trauma, you, I don't know, fall in a pool or something, you almost die or something bad happens, that could also cause a fixation according to Freud. We'll talk a little bit later on, but Freud is, again, really big on looking back at these early formative years and looking for trauma and trying to figure out, okay, how does that then affect you later on? How does that cause issues later on? The next piece we'll talk about is what is called an Oedipus complex. So we'll watch a little bit of a video about this that will kind of explain it in a little more detail. But our Oedipus complex was, again, basically kind of a result of fixation that Freud believed in. Now, we also have, I don't think I have it on here, but the Electra complex, which is basically the same thing as the Oedipus complex, but for women. So the Oedipus complex, if you've ever heard the story of Oedipus, is like a Greek, I think it was a Greek myth, where basically there's like a prophecy, and the king finds that his firstborn son is going to kill him or something along those lines. And so they like send him away, and eventually, it happens that the kid ends up coming back, and he doesn't know who his parents are. He accidentally kills his father and marries his mother, right? And so the Oedipus complex is, according to Freud, is a boy's sexual desires toward his mother and feelings of jealousy and hatred for the father, who becomes a rival, basically. Now, again, if we're talking about the Electra complex, it's the same thing, but flipped. So it would be a girl's sexual desires towards her father, and thus jealousy and hatred for the mother that would be a rival. Okay? Both of these would take place during the phallic stage, and then would, again, if we have this kind of fixation, would represent themselves later on in life. Now, what we expect to see, right, in a healthy development would be children eventually coping with the threatening feelings by repressing them into the unconscious and by identifying with the like parent, right? So we're going to then identify with, if I'm a male with my father, if I'm a female with my mother, and then thus trying to kind of become like that. And we'll see that in this next slide as well. So Oedipus complex, Electra complex. That gets us to identification, and this is, again, kind of coming right out of our different complexes that we just talked about. So identification is a process where children incorporate their parents' values into their superego. So if you remember, the id is something we're born with. The superego develops over time, right? Because it's about authority figures and authority in general. So the superego is going to be developing. So as we age, right, we start developing the superego. And one of the things that's developing is this kind of identification, where we start to look at our parents and start to incorporate the different things that they care about, the different things that they do, into our superego. And thus, we become like them. And again, you can think of a lot of very simple examples of, children going out and mimicking their parents, where little girls want to wear makeup like their mom, and little boys, maybe go out and they mow the lawn with their little fake lawnmower because their dad mows the lawn, right? Those would be considered things that he would look at and say, that's identification. Freud believed that identification with that same-sex parent was also going to provide what we now call gender identity. They didn't refer to gender identity then, but today we would refer to it as gender identity, or basically the idea of what it means to be male, what it means to be female, or how those things are kind of combined, right? So the general idea is that you learn what those things are from your parents. So if your father is one way, you learn that's what that means to be a male. You start to incorporate that, and that's what it means to be a male and what it means to be masculine. And if the way your mother is going to be how you understand being female, how you understand being a woman, right? So we incorporate those in, and they become how we identify ourselves, but also look at other people, and we expect other people to understand those things. That's going to get us to our next piece, and there's a lot in here, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on with Freud's. So the next piece is defense mechanisms. I'm not going to talk a ton about them in this video, Again, you'll get a kind of handout that we do, and we'll do a little practice using them. They're relatively straightforward, and there's kind of a lot to talk about. So we're just going to go kind of quick, right? So I'm going to give you a general idea of what defense mechanisms are, but we'll talk about them more specifically in class. So defense mechanisms in general is a theory, right, that the ego uses protective methods to reducing anxiety, right, by unconsciously distorting reality. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that we do this, right? And again, this is what's really important. So our ego, our conscious mind, is trying to protect us from things that are make us anxious, right? You could think of them as stressors if you want to think about stress, right? So it's trying to reduce anxiety of a bunch of different things, right? Negative things, by distorting reality. So all of these are going to have to do with distorting reality a little bit. So to give you some examples, or our main ones are regression, reaction formation, projection, rationalization, displacement, sublimation, and denial. So I can give you kind of a simple example. So let's just kind of think of one. So let's use displacement. I think that's kind of an easy one to think about. So yeah, actually, let's do rationalization. I think would probably be the best one. Let's do rationalization. So the example we'll actually see in class in that little piece of paper you'll get is going to be a kid like trying to join a team. I think it's a soccer team, right? So you go out, right, and you want to join this soccer team, and you go out, you try hard, and for whatever reason you don't make the team. Okay. Now, when that happens to us, when we fail at something, for example, that is an anxiety-inducing moment, right? That is a stressor to us. It's stressful to feel like you failed, like you can't achieve something or didn't achieve something. So what psychoanalytic theorists would say, and what Freud would say, is that we will deal with that and reduce that anxiety by distorting the reality of the situation. So rationalization, for example, we could maybe say that, you know what, at the end of the day, I actually didn't want to be on the soccer team anyway. I want to do this instead, right? That's a way of, so what's happening is I'm distorting reality just a little bit, right? Because I obviously want to be on the team to begin with, but when I don't make it, that's stressful, that's anxious. So if I kind of shift that a little bit and say, you know what, I actually didn't really want to do it that much anyway, that reduces that anxiety, right? It brings it down. It kind of brings that stressor down. So this is how they're going to say that we deal with these different kind of anxiety ridden events or moments. And again, there's a bunch of different ones. That's just kind of one simple example, but we'll look at these specifically in class. So that wraps up the first piece, which is psychoanalysis or the psychoanalytic theory. Again, psychoanalysis is really Freud. You may have noticed that everything we talked about with Freud's perspective specifically. So this is where we're going to see the shift or the divide between psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theories. So psychodynamic theories are going to be very similar. They're still going to view personality with a focus on the unconscious and the importance of childhood experiences, right? So it's very similar to what Freud was saying. The difference is these are not going to be specifically Freud's theories. They are going to be descendants of Freud. So these are people who came after Freud, who looked at his teachings and basically, looked at these different things and tweaked it a little bit. There's still the general ideas are there, still focuses on the unconscious, still focuses on importance on childhood experiences, but not going to quite agree with everything that Freud said. And you can see there's kind of a lot of very specific things that Freud is advocating for. They're going to change it a little bit. There's two big ways that they are going to adjust these theories. The first one is they're going to increase the role of consciousness. So they believe that conscious thought has a bigger impact than Freud did. Freud really, really focused on unconscious thought, as you can see. The second thing is they're going to decrease the roles of sex and violence. So you notice that pretty much all of the things we talked about had to do with sex and violence as far as Freud was concerned. So psychodynamic theorists are going to kind of look at that and go, you know what, like these have a role, but I don't think they're quite as important as Freud is saying they are. I think maybe it's a little bit decreased, a little bit lesser. So that's going to be the big kind of difference. So we do have another really important thinker, though, when it comes to psychodynamic theorists, and that is Carl Jung. So Jung is, again, a psychodynamic thinker. So he's kind of a descendant, right, at least intellectually, from Freud. So he still is going to focus on these unconscious drives, right? He agrees with Freud in that aspect. But he thought the unconscious was more than just repressed desires, memories, and feelings. So he thinks he's more in there. So Jung believes in what is called a collective unconscious, that basically there is a common unconscious that we all share as human beings. Okay? This is supposedly our common collection of images that we have gained together as human beings from our ancestral and environmental past. So it's kind of the idea that you can think of, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't want to do that. It's kind of the idea that you can think of, like if I told you all right now to picture a dog, right? Just imagine a dog. The idea is that if we all took that image and put it down on a piece of paper, a lot of us would have a common image. Right now, obviously, this is there's a lot of other things that take into consideration, but Jung believed that we would have this kind of common identity, this common collection of things that represent stuff. And you can kind of see this, right? We could look at maybe like religious texts, for examples, and the stories that are told in different religious texts, and see certain imagery that's used over and over and over again, right? Even in religions that maybe wouldn't have had a lot of contact or were on different parts of the world, or we can see representations that are used. So like, for example, a snake is very common used in a specific context, right? It's generally used to represent something evil or sneaky, right? Where we don't really see it necessarily being used in like a brave, it doesn't represent bravery, generally speaking. So that would be this idea, this collective unconscious, that there's kind of these images that we have, there's these ideas that we have that all humans share. Okay, and we're going to kind of get into what these are and some more examples in just a second as well. So again, Jung, psychodynamic thinker, agrees with Freud that there's these unconscious drives that are really important, but he doesn't agree that the unconscious is just filled with kind of repressed desires and memories and feelings. He thinks there's these other collective things in there as well. So Jung is going to look at archetypes. Okay, and this is again going back to this collective images. So he believes there's these archetypes, which are these images and thoughts which have universal meanings across cultures, which may show up in dream, literature, art, or religion. So again, the idea is that when you go around and you look at art, and you look at literature, and you look at religions, and you look at dreams people have across the world or across culture, according to Jung, what you would expect to see are these archetypes, these similar images, these similar ideas that show up again and again and again and again and again, right? And those different things are going to represent something. They represent something in our collective conscience. These are all products of the collective experiences of men and women living together, that these just come out of life, basically. Now, this is where things get a little muddy. There's a lot of ways and a lot of people that have taken Jung's ideas and kind of gone a lot of different directions with them. We're going to try and stay relatively narrow and focus on just kind of four major pieces, okay? So Jung believed in, there's a lot of, again, these archetypes can be divided into like 20 different ones sometimes, depending on how it's looked at, but we're going to look at four, okay? Four archetypes. So you can see them on the right here. We're going to talk about each one. We have our self, the anima or animus, we have the shadow, and we have the persona. Okay. One thing I want to mention as well for our Jungian Mask assignment, these are what you're going to want to be using here. So our first one is our persona or our mask. This is the conformity archetype. So what the persona represents is our outward face. It is what we show the world. It's a mask. Now, what's important is the persona is different from who we really are. It's an important concept, that we have this mask that is different from the internal reality. And what it does is it conceals that real self. It conceals these primitive urges, these impulses, these emotions. It's concealing things that we kind of keep in, and it's presenting things on the outward, right? If you wanted to think about, I'm sure we've all experienced where, we were just really upset or down or angry or sad or whatever. But when you go to school, you kind of just fake it. That's the idea of a persona, that there's this kind of outward mask that we wear to show the world, but the reality is there's other things internally that are very different. That's this idea of the persona. So that's one archetype. Another archetype we have is the anima or animus. Anima or animus. So the anima or animus represents the mirror image of us based on biological sex. Okay, so if it's the animus if you're female, and the anima if you are male. Okay, so again, it's you, but it's the opposite biological sex. Okay, so in males, this would represent our unconscious feminine side, and in females, it'd be our unconscious masculine side. Right, so it's pretty simple on that one, right? Again, it's the opposite. So if I'm a male, these would be the unconscious things within me that are feminine. If I was female, it would be the unconscious things within me, these tendencies within me that are masculine. That gets us to our next two, which are the shadow and the self. So the shadow is kind of similar to the id, actually. The shadow is the animal side of our personality. It is part of our unconscious mind. It's repressed ideas, weaknesses, desires, instincts, and shortcomings. Now, it's similar to the id in kind of this unconscious, kind of more animalistic aspect of who we are. Notice, though, it's not just aggression and sexual desires, right? It's things that we repress, it's weaknesses, it's instincts, it's shortcomings, right? It's kind of like all of these negative aspects of who we are. That's kind of the best way to think of it, right? It's kind of negative, impulsive things that are kind of repressed down underneath. And the last piece is the self. So the self is a sense of unity in experience. The ultimate aim of every individual is to achieve a state of selfhood. So you can kind of connect this pretty well with Maslow's hierarchies of needs and self-actualization. So if the shadow is kind of all of the negative weakness, instinctual sides of us that is full of shortcomings, right? All these kind of negative aspects of who we are. The self is the opposite. It is who we want to be. It is who we wish we could become. It's our aim in life. And so you can kind of see how the self and the shadow are kind of dichotomies, right? They're kind of opposite sides. So we've got those pieces. We have, again, our persona, which is this mask that we show to the world that hides everything else behind. And then we have our anima or animus, which is our opposite sex, right? And those pieces that are a part of us, even though they're part of the opposite sex. One thing too, again, there's a lot more to obviously talk about. We're really kind of just hitting the surface on these ideas, but these are the pieces that you need for as far as we're going to go, as far as you'll need on the AP test, and kind of for the assignment that will be coming with this. So the last piece we're going to talk about is how do we actually look at the unconscious? Because it's unconscious, right? That's the challenge is how do you look at someone's thoughts if they can't think about them directly, if they can't express them vocally. And that's what we're going to look at is what are called projective tests. Now, these are all things that are developed in psychodynamics and used in psychodynamics, and actually still today to at least some extent, to try and do just that, right? To try and assess unconscious processes, unconscious thoughts, unconscious feelings. So projective tests are personality tests that provide some sort of ambiguous images. Okay, and they don't necessarily, usually they're going to use images, but something ambiguous is going to be presented, And the idea is what they're supposed to do is allow you to project onto them, which will show your inner kind of mechanisms. Okay, so again, we're going to show you something that's ambiguous, and then you are going to project onto it, and that's really important, right? The idea is when I give you something that really doesn't have any meaning, and I ask you, what does this mean? What you're going to tell me is something that you are creating yourself, and thus the idea is that it's showing me your unconscious processes, your unconscious thoughts. Now, projective tests have been criticized quite a bit for having poor reliability and validity and lacking scientific evidence. And we're going to kind of see a lot of that at the end of this section. So here's some examples, though, of projective tests. So one of the big one is thematic apperception test, or the TAT. So what it is, we have a projective test where you're going to be shown a specific image, basically a still that is just a still image, right? It's just a picture. And what you need to do is you have to basically create the story around the image. So this is an example of one. So what would happen is a psychologist would show you an image like this one, and they would say, tell me what's happening here. Okay? And that's the idea. Now again, when you look at this image, there is a million things you could talk about here, right? We have no idea what's going on before this, what's going on after this. You know, even their facial expressions are kind of hard to read, right? You can look at it and think that there's maybe anger, you can look at it, there's might be sadness, there could maybe be love, there's any emotion, you can read anything into it, which is the idea again. So what would happen is you would tell this story, and I, as a psychologist, would be, taking notes, and I'd be writing it down. And what I would do is look at what are the things that you're putting into this story. And the idea is that's going to tell me what's going on in your unconscious mind. Okay? Notice, obviously, it's very, very subjective, which is one of the problems with projective tests. The most famous and most widely used projective test is the Rorschach test. Rorschach. Inkblot test, right? Which is created, I'm not going to say his last name, or Herman. And we've all seen this one before, right? It's a set of inkblots, usually 10 of them, and they show, right, random things. So you can look at it. Basically, the idea is there's ink on it, they're folded in half, and so it's an exact replica, right? It's two halves of the same thing. And again, they show you these images, and you are supposed to project onto it. What do you see? What do you feel? What are you expressing, right? What does this tell you? Now again, these are just random ink blots. They don't actually mean anything. They're just random blots of color and ink. So when you project onto it, ideally what that tells me is how you feel. If you tell me that it represents anger or violence or whatever, that tells me, right, at least theoretically, tells me that you feel anger and you feel like there should be violence and whatever. So we're going to analyze how you interpret them. So that's going to kind of wrap up that look. Now what we want to look at here is how we view Freud and how we view psychodynamics today. Because obviously you can tell by a lot of these ideas, they're pretty old and there's been a lot that's changed. So one of the big things that is positive is that Freud is definitely given credit for drawing attention to the unconscious mind. It wasn't really something that was looked at least not in this kind of very specific way. He drew a lot of attention to the importance of sexuality, as well as the conflict that we have between our biological impulses and our social restraints, right? There are things that we might want to do that we don't because of society, right? So there's this conflict between those two sides of us. So Freud's given credit for kind of doing all those things, or at least drawing attention to it. Now, kind of after that, as you can imagine, a lot of the stuff that he actually thought, we really don't believe is true anymore. So research doesn't really support most anything that Freud believed specifically, right? You can maybe say general ideas, maybe, but as far as like the development of children or repression or I'm sorry, defense mechanisms or the id, ego, superego. There isn't really any research that supports any of that. In addition, these psychodynamic concepts didn't provide any real like measurements. So for example, if I was a psychodynamic psychologist, or I used the psychodynamic theory, and I was supposed to do a personality test on you, I would have to go through and basically spend hours and hours talking to you and giving you projective tests and kind of going through all sorts of kind of work. So what happens is one, that's obviously very slow, and it takes a really long time. The other problem is it's not very precise. My evaluation of you might be very different than somebody else's evaluation. And as a science, that's not a good thing. We want things to be similar. We want them to be reliable. And that gets us to our last point, which is our evaluations are impressionistic. So when you tell me a story, about that image that we saw earlier, my impressions of what that tells me about you might be very different from a different psychologist. So these are not quantitative measures, right? We're not actually measuring how many times do you use a certain term, how often do you have a fight with this person, how do you answer this specific type of question, right? We're not connecting it with any form of data. That's obviously, again, a very negative thing. So what we're going to see is after Freud, right, as kind of psychology becomes more of like a true science, and again, he didn't necessarily start with Freud. There were psychologists before him, obviously, but kind of became really popular. And as we've continued to move, right, we've moved more and more away from kind of the social, like the soft science, the social sciences, and more towards the hard sciences, where it's more and more important now that there's specific data and specific quantitative measures that we have that tell us this is that personality, this is what that personality means, this is what that personality tells us about this person, right? And I can have a million different psychologists give the same test and they'll come up with relatively similar answers. Oops, there we go. Okay, that's what I want to get to. In addition, let's talk a little bit, and this is kind of will be the last slide if I remember correctly, thinking about how do we view the unconscious mind today. Okay, so one of the big things is that we know that we don't have full access to everything in the mind. We know that there's things going on in our brains that we aren't able to control. I think I can give a specific example of like, our heart obviously is beating all the time. Our brain is telling our heart to beat. But you don't really have any, like, you can't like consciously think about that, right? You're not consciously thinking beat, 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 beat. We can't access that. So we know there's things going on in there. We know our brain continues to work on problems even when we aren't consciously doing it. That's why we have like insight, right? Where we have that light bulb moment where we just remember something. So we know there's things going on that we don't have access to. But the way we view it is very different than the way Freud did. So our current view of the unconscious is not that it's a hidden storehouse filled with memories and feelings, right? We know that there's a bunch of stuff there. We know it's doing things. We know that there's processes going on, but we don't think it's this kind of repressed feelings, repressed emotions, repressed drives that are kind of just sitting in there, pushing us in different ways. We also know the neuroscience has shown that the major brain structures essential for forming conscious memories are not functional during the first 2 years of life. So again, one of the really big things that was important to both psychoanalysis and psychodynamic thinkers was kind of like childhood memories and these repressed things that happen to us even right after birth. But we actually know that the structures that are forming conscious memories aren't even working during those first 2 years. So it's not even possible to form conscious memories during that time period, which again is going to kind of stray from what our earlier theorists believed. Okay, so that wraps up this kind of longer conversation about psychoanalytic, and psychodynamic thinkers. Take some time, right? This is a pretty long section, so make sure you take a little bit of time, write about 4 or 5 sentences summarizing, and then I will see you guys next time.